Hello, everyone. Welcome to another brief lecture for our Phil 115 material. This is chapter 3, identifying and evaluating arguments. So this chapter has a lot of slides, so I'm going to try to go through them in a relatively quick manner, not because it's worth skipping through, but just want to keep these, again, as always, as short as I can without going over or without skipping too much material. So this chapter, as the name implies, is about argumentation. And that's a major aspect to our class and to philosophy more generally, assessing arguments. It's also important for everyday context. So just to briefly review what an argument is, it's reason or reasons for thinking that something is the case. The conclusion is the statement that is being supported in a passage, and the premise or premises are the statement or statements doing the supporting. These function as the reasons or evidence, if you will, for why one should accept the conclusion. And we call it an inference when we go from the premise or premises to the conclusion. It's that reasoning process. So an argument can have more than one premise, but it can have only one conclusion. So this is why we've done the present in standard form arguments in class and in the discussion. So we typically list the premises in order and then the conclusion at the bottom, oftentimes with this single horizontal line. And the inference is the reasoning process by which we go from the reasons to the conclusion. So that's why it's important that these three not be completely separate, right? There must be something that connects the premise or premises to the conclusion. Otherwise, we don't even really have an argument. So there must be that inferential link, we might call it, between the reasons or the premises to the conclusion. So what do we do with arguments? Well, the point of devising an argument is to try to show that a statement or a claim is worthy of acceptance and why somebody else should too. And the point of evaluating an argument is to see whether this task has been successful. This is a key feature of critical thinking, right? So whether the argument shows that the statement or the conclusion really is worthy of acceptance. So when the argument shows that the statement is worthy of acceptance, we generally say that that argument is a good one. And when the argument fails to show that the statement is worthy of acceptance, we say that the argument is bad. But we'll use more technical philosophical language to distinguish good arguments from bad. So arguments come in two types, and the first type is called deductive argumentation. So deductive arguments that we use all the time are intended to give logically conclusive support to their conclusions so that if the premises are true, the conclusion absolutely must be true. In other words, it follows by necessity from the structure of the premises. So here's an example. All cats are mammals. Sophie is a cat, therefore Sophie is a mammal. The idea is that this conclusion follows necessarily, assuming these two things are true. Thus, this reasoning in general is deductive. The idea is that if this is true, premise 1 and premise 2 is true, C must be true, or at least that's the intention. So a deductive argument is valid. That is, it has the right structure, just in case if the premises are true, the conclusion could not be false. In other words, the premises guarantee the conclusion. It's successful in doing that. So an argument can be composed of all true statements, but have a structure that does not preserve the truth of the conclusion. So how about this? All philosophers are cool. Anthony is cool. Therefore, Anthony is a philosopher. So even though it's true that I'm a philosopher, and I don't know, maybe I'm cool. Maybe I'm not. I don't know. And maybe we don't think premise 1 is true. The problem is there's something wrong with the structure in this argument. Because the conclusion, even though it could be true, it's not guaranteed, because essentially what this is all A's are B's. Here's a B, therefore it must be an A. And that's problematic because it doesn't guarantee that if the premises are true, the conclusion must also be true. So that's why the concept of validity is so crucial. So a deductive argument then that has the right or proper logical structure is said to be valid. A deductive argument that does not have the proper logical structure is said to be invalid. And again, the book goes over a couple of examples. So the validity or lack thereof of deductive arguments is a separate issue from the truth of the premises. So we don't want to confuse whether they're actually true with the concept of validity. Validity is a structural matter, depending on how an argument is put together and the terms are arranged. So truth concerns the nature of the claims made in the premises and the conclusion. So content and structure are two importantly separate things. So this is where the concept of soundness comes in. A deductive argument is sound just in case it is deductively valid and all the premises as well as the conclusion are true. So an argument can have the right structure, but have one or more false premises. So here's an example. All men have 5 arms. Anthony is a man. Therefore, Anthony has 5 arms. Now, obviously, I don't have 5 arms, and premise 1 is false, but this is a valid argument. It has the right structure, right? Because this is all A's or B's. Here's an A, so it must be a B. That's the right kind of structure. But clearly, premise 1 is false, right? But it's still valid. So the argument is valid, but unsound. So that's a really important distinction. It's in the book. Please let me know if you need further help with the concepts of validity and soundness. But we want to be aware of invalid arguments. They can have a structure very similar to valid argument forms, but their conclusions do not necessarily follow from their premises. So there's my cat, Sophie, if you can see her there. How about all Jedi love vegetables? Sophie loves vegetables. Therefore, Sophie is a Jedi. So she does like to sit there when I'm cooking, laying on bags of vegetables, not entirely sure why, but she does. But this argument, is it a good one? No, it's invalid, right? Because as I pointed out in the earlier example, any argument that has this form or structure is defective. It's invalid. It doesn't guarantee that if the premises are true, the conclusion will also be true. Because this thing is a B, it doesn't mean that it's an A, right? So if it's the case that the conclusion does not follow necessarily from the premises, it cannot be valid, right? So we prefer valid arguments in philosophy and in everyday life for hopefully obvious reasons. Okay, deductively valid arguments can, however, have false premises and a false conclusion and still be valid. So how about this? All men have 5 arms. Sophie is a man. Sophie has 5 arms. That's valid, even though Sophie's not a man. It has the right structure. It can also have false premises and a true conclusion. All Jedi eat their veggies. Anthony is a Jedi. Anthony eats his veggies. False premises and a true conclusion, still valid. And ideally, we want arguments that have true premises and a true conclusion and are valid. Those would be sound. All cats are mammals. Sophie is a cat. Therefore, Sophie's a mammal. That would be a sound argument. But deductively valid arguments cannot have false premises and a false, it can't lead from true premises to a false conclusion. Okay. So, yeah, this example actually needs to be changed, but it can never take you from true premises to a false conclusion. So this one actually isn't an example of this because a valid argument can have false premises and a false conclusion, but it can't lead you from true premises to a false conclusion. So I'll make a correction for that, and we can talk about it in class. So it can never lead you from true premises to a false conclusion. Okay, so again, deductive arguments try to prove or demonstrate its conclusion. It's valid just in case if the premises are true, the conclusion must also be true. And they're truth preserving. Their logical structure guarantees the truth of the conclusion if the premise or premises are true. And they're sound just in case they're deductively valid and all the premises as well as the conclusion are true. Okay, so I'm going to skip over the practice because we can do those in class. Let's skip ahead to inductive arguments because obviously we don't use everyday arguments. Most arguments in everyday cases are inductive, not deductive. So inductive arguments try to give probable support to their conclusion. This is where we use probability, likelihood, things like that. They try to make the conclusions probably true. So here's an example. 85% of the students at Green River are right-handed. Sophie is a student at Green River. Therefore, Sophie is probably right-handed. Pretty strong argument, right? Is it guaranteed like in deduction? No. But that's a different kind of argument than the one we had before. When we use terms like all or none or some, those are deductive words. So that's why we assign strength or weakness to an inductive argument. So a strong argument is any inductive argument. If the premises were true, then the conclusion is more likely to be true than not. That would be a strong argument. So an argument can be composed of all true statements, but the conclusion may still likely be false. Right? Some philosophers are Italian. Anthony is a philosopher. Therefore, Anthony is Italian. Right? It's still possible that I'm not Italian. And so in this case, right, this would be a weak argument. So even though the conclusion is actually true, it is not made more likely to be true by the premises. So it would be weak, not strong. So inductive arguments that succeed in lending probable support to their conclusions are said to be strong. And strong arguments are such that if their premises are true, the conclusions are probably true. Inductive arguments that fail to provide this kind of support are said to be weak. So we don't want to confuse valid and invalid, strong and weak, right? One set belongs to deductive reasoning, and then the other terms apply to inductive reasoning. Okay, so an inductively strong argument with all true premises is said to be cogent, not sound. So, you know, an example would be something like, the Bumper Shoot concert has been held every Labor Day weekend since 1971. Therefore, it will probably be held Labor Day weekend next year as well. Now, this actually isn't sound because because of COVID, Bumper Shoot got canceled for the first time in 40 years. So this shows you the problem with induction, that, you know, it just takes one case for the whole thing to fall apart. But up until COVID, this was a sound argument, right? Because it's strong and all the premises as well as the conclusion are true. Most cats are playful. Sophie's a cat, therefore Sophie is playful. That would be a cogent argument, I think. So to review inductive arguments, we try to make the conclusion more probable or likely than not. We say that inductive arguments are strong when, if the premises are true, the conclusion is also probably true. They're not truth preserving like deductive arguments are, though. Their logical structure does not guarantee the truth of the conclusion, even if the premises are true, right? So even if we have 99% certainty, it doesn't guarantee that the conclusion will necessarily be the case. And a cogent argument is any inductively strong argument with all true premises and a true conclusion. Okay, so I'll skip over these. We'll do those in class. Another kind of inductive argument that's mentioned in the text is abductive arguments. We're going to come back to this in a later chapter, but the most common kind of, shall we say, an offshoot of an inductive argument is called inference to the best explanation. We use this all the time. Okay, it's where we reason from premises about a state of affairs to an explanation for that state of affairs. So if you've ever gone out to your car and tried to start it and it wouldn't start, and you're trying to figure out what the cause is, you've done inference to the best explanation, right? You're probably thinking, what, I'm out of gas, I left the battery on. But it's also possible, although not very likely, that someone, you know, went in and messed up your car engine or siphoned the gasoline out, right? So those are possible, but not very likely. The most likely or best explanation is that you left the light on and the battery was drained, or you forgot to fill up your car with gas, right? So, I mean, we could even use other examples. Anthony failed his philosophy course. The best explanation for his failure is that he didn't read the material. Therefore, he probably didn't read the material, right? So the book does use a couple of really nice tools for steps to how to assess arguments. So if we have an argument, one of our first questions is, well, what kind of argument is it? There are only two, inductive or deductive. And then if we can figure out what kind of reasoning is there, then we ask, is it successful? Well, if it's a deductive argument that's successful, it's valid. If it's not, if it doesn't have the right structure, it's invalid. If it's an inductive argument and it's successful, it's strong. If it's not successful, it's weak. Then we ask, does it have true premises? Well, if it's deductively valid and all the premises and conclusion are true, then it's sound. If it doesn't, then it's unsound. All invalid arguments are unsound by definition. For inductive argumentation, it can be strong but uncogent. If it's actually true, as well as the conclusion, then it would be cogent. So I think this is a really helpful slide to kind of bring everything together. All right, so if you have any questions about these, please be sure to let me know. So I'm going to skip the practice for this, and we'll come back to that. One quick note here about non-arguments. Obviously, a lot of things on the internet and in speeches and even written word are non-argumentative. So not everything that people say is meant to be an argument for hopefully obvious reasons. Sometimes persuasive writing contains no arguments at all, right? Sometimes it's just a rant or a long-winded, I don't know, diatribe. Doesn't mean that there's an argument there. So many people, including some very good thinkers and writers, think that if they clearly express their opinions, then they have given an argument, but that's not the case, right? A bunch of opinions strung together does not constitute an argument by definition. Sometimes opinions are so weakly supported that they're almost indistinguishable from completely unsupported ones. So we have to be good about assessing whether there's actually an argument there. Okay. One process that the book mentions that I think is good, step one, find the conclusion. What's the overall passage that this writer or speaker is trying to convince you of? Because if you can do that, whether it's online or in person, then you can start to see, okay, well, what are their reasons for why I should accept this? And are they good? Is it the case that if the premises are true, its conclusion is probably true? Or is it intended to be, if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true? Because if the answer is yes to step two, then we've identified what? A deductive argument. If the answer is yes to three, then we've identified what? An inductive argument. Okay, so I think this is a good four-step process. It's not, we're not always going to use it, but I think something like this is a process that I myself use. And then the last step is the argument intended to offer conclusive or probable support, but fails to do so? In other words, if I've already established what kind of argument it is it successful? Are the premises actually true? Or does it provide probable support? So I like this four-step process that's outlined in the book. Some people, have it as 3 steps or 5 steps or whatever, but I definitely agree with step one. What's the conclusion? If you can't answer that, then you may not have an argument there. And oftentimes I'll read something online or elsewhere, and if I can't find the conclusion, then I don't have an argument, right? And then I've got to make another set of judgments about what to do with what's being written or said. Okay, so let me skip this. Sometimes a lot of arguments have what we call implicit premises. These are premises that might be missing from the actual text or the writing or the speech. So we might search for a credible premise that would make the argument valid. We want to employ what I call the principle of charity. Whenever anyone's speaking, even if it's someone we don't agree with, we want to give them the most plausible interpretation for their argument, right? We want to invoke the principle of charity. That's most plausible, fits best with the author's intent. And then the second step is we search for a credible premise that would make the argument as strong as possible, or choose the supplied premise that fulfills the steps above. So if it's meant to be a deductive argument, then I'm going to insert a claim that would make it deductively valid. If it's intended to be an inductive argument, then I want to choose a claim or statement that would make it as plausible or strong as possible. And then I evaluate it from there. So we'll do some practice with this going forward, as well as some other exercises together, hopefully. Okay. And then let's end with assessing long arguments. So common obstacles to assessing long arguments are, first and foremost, right? There's a lot of times people will say things and they're not as clear. This is why we love putting arguments in a standard form, because it's very clear, right? Premise 1, premise 2, premise 3, conclusion. But obviously not everybody talks like that. Sometimes the premise or premises or conclusion are implicit, in which case it takes work on our part to try to figure out what's being said or offered. And that's difficult in many cases. And sometimes only a small portion of the prose contains statements that serve as the premise or premises and the conclusion. So many longer works purporting to be filled with arguments contain very few arguments or none at all. So we have to be careful in such cases, right? So a couple of steps: study the text or passage until we thoroughly understand it. Sometimes that means more than once. There's nothing wrong with rereading a text or passage until we get it. And sometimes that's the author's fault, right? They could have made their arguments clearer, but we got to work with what we're given, right? So find the conclusion, right? I think that's a great place to start. What's the conclusion? And then we can figure out, all right, what kind of support or reasons are being offered to support that conclusion. Okay, so I'm going to skip that. Let me leave it there for chapter 3. We'll talk in more detail in chapter 4 about deductive argument types, as well as do some practice in class. And learn some argument form names so that we can more easily separate good arguments from bad ones. So thanks as always for listening, and be sure to let me know if you have any questions.